How's it going, everyone? Welcome. Javier Gonzalez here. Today, let's take a look at the relative position, in particular, all the possible layout mode that we can have in positioning layouts, and what happened when we open into this. So, for example, like relative or absolute, to understand the notion of the containing block, the stacking context, as well as the fix, the overflow, and the sticky position. So let's get into this and how also this fits into the entire CSS. So because at the end of the day, CSS is the language to describe how all of these different HTML elements are going to look like on media devices or any devices, right? Particularly is on media device like box. And this is the foundation of the CSS, that everything here is a box. So this box has a particular anatomy, which is the content, the margin, the padding, and the border. In the OG layout, which is the flow layout or the normal layout. So all of those elements are orderly in a nicely next to each other, okay? And in order to calculate the width and the height, it has a particular algorithm that by default the width, when you use now percentage, is gonna be based on the widest content element. And then you also have is the measurement values like percentage, pixels, and root elements, or the keyword value, which is defining in a specific behavior. So for example, like feed content is pretty self-explanatory. So the width will going to adjust, or the width of that box will be adjust to the content. And then you have now the mean content or the max content. And the mean content say, hey, the minimum width that this box will have, it'll be based on the widest children element, right? And the max content is say, hey, well, you're gonna take all the available space needed. So this is the width, and also I look at the height. So by default, again, it follows these two possible values: measurement and keywords. In particularly with the percentage of this measurement, it's gonna base it is, or by default, when you don't define any, when you just let as the auto, all right, it's going to calculate is as so the width will be is the minimal size of that content, right? Yep, is the minimum size of that content. All right. I'll make a quick pause here. And all right. So, in terms of the width, how this is calculated, when the width you use now the outer, so the algorithm is going to take is the small minimal height dimension for that element, and that is what is going to be applied. This is one of the reasons why when you want to get the 100% of the height element, you don't get is what you think, what you might expect, which is the full height. So you have to now pass down from the root element, which is the HTML element, and then now you can have access and get the full height of that viewport. So this is just to describe the basic notions of this CSS, right? So in terms of the CSS, what is the model that is being used to represent all of these elements into any visual media. So for example, here as this screen as a box, what is the anatomy of this box and how this box is calculated. It is dimensions, width and height. And now how all of these boxes interact to each other by default, whether it's block, inline or inline block. And also the notion of the margin and the behavior margin, like margin clap, which is a very easy concept to understand. So when two margins are in the same, so this is what happens when you have two elements that have margin sharing the same space, and there's some things that happen, right? So for example, is this when you add in too much margin to one element to another, so that modify the layout. For example, the bigger margin wins. If you have now, so there's several rules that follows that, right? So this is the OG layout, and because CSS wasn't conceived originally to design now layout, it was more to present content, on how do we read content, how the content is written, known as the writing mode, whether it's inline, or how you read that context, whether it is left or right to left, or even top and down for hands-based characters. And then how all of this content stack to each other. In the case of Western cultures, we read that from top to bottom. The same for Middle East cultures. But that's not true for a hand-based character. When they read now, the content is stacking instead of top down. They read that from right to left. Again, part of the writing modes. But in the case of the positioning layout, right, when instead of now having all of these different boxes nicely orderly next to each other, I do need is to find ways to put that on top of another elements, right? So for example, if I need to build some menu or some UI, like a model, or need to show some pop-up or some content that I need you to state present in the entire screen. So in those scenarios, I do need to have some way to present that kind of content, and that's what we have now, the positioning layout. So this come up with several different modes: the relative, the absolute, the fixed, and sticky. And here is when it's starting to look and understand concepts like stacking context and the C index and some of the things that we need to know as we progress here with CSS, right? So for example, things like what happened when you use now the positioning layout, how you opt into this mode, and for example, in the case of using the position keyword and opt into the relative. So there are a couple things that happen. First, it enables additional properties like the positioning properties, top, right, bottom, left, and also the setting constraints to the children elements. So in the case of the relative, so this, unlike for example margin that modified the layout, positioning doesn't modify the elements on the layouts. So position behave like you putting now elements in the normal flow next to each other, all right? And you can now use these elements and move them around to make them so you can use them, for example, to express special notations, right? For example, scientific notations, or when you want to move that element here. So that's relative positioning according to this. And then I'm gonna look at the CSS docs as well. And then I look at the position, absolute positioning. So sometimes you want is your elements to actually now stay on top of another elements. So when it comes to creating now things like a menu or a model or things that you want to or decorative things that you want to now show on top of that, so now we have is the absolute positioning. And again, the same two things happens. It enables you to use the positioning properties and to set constraints to the children node. So what happens when you use position absolute by default without any of the positioning properties? So it's gonna behave like a normal elements in the normal flow, right? However, when you started to modify the position of these elements, when you up into the top, for example, top, right, bottom, left, so now this element is going to look at the closest containing block, which is something that I actually look at this, okay? Knowing as of how aware this element is going to live. When you use that by default without any position property, and when you starting to modifying its position, for example, in this case, right? So that's the default placement here, right? So the default placement is that it is the inflow position, and the other is that how these elements behave when you pull out of the normal flow. For example, the absolute. So these elements behave like an hologram on top of that, especially the content and the letters. But the background is going to overlap on top of that. And the other is that the patterns collapse. All right, this is something that I'm not quite familiar with. I didn't get this concept right, because the idea is this. Okay, exactly. The idea is this. So you have now a parent and a child, right? The parent and the child both are on the interesting. Okay, now I get it. So both these elements are now in the normal flow. Okay, both of these elements are in the normal flow. So if you now the children if you now open to the children, if you now open to that children to be now in the positioning layer as an absolute element, right? What happened is that unlike elements like this, right, when they are on the normal float, parent and child here, these elements, they are now wrapping around each other, right? Or you'll notice that the parent collapsed down. So in this example, we have a pink box sitting within the black border pattern. When we toggle on the position absolute, you'll notice the pattern collapsed down. So that is the 8 pixels tall, which is 4 pixels on the top border and the bottom. So why does this happen? Well, in terms of the flow layer, the pattern is empty. In terms of the flow layer, the parent, okay, the parent is empty. And remember, absolute elements are like hologram, okay? Absolute elements are like holograms. So for example, if I say something like this, if I say something like this, so absolute elements are like holograms, and because those elements, so now the pattern collapsed down, it is part of the flow layout. It is not an element from the positioning layout. But if we now up into the element to be a positioning relative, right? It's still behaving as it is, right? So these elements now, they behave, particularly the absolute, they behave position relative, yeah. So they behave now as hologram here. So making the so it's like making the child element like if it was an empty div here. So remember, the absolute elements are like holograms, so they don't really exist. Since this parent element has no children, if it was an empty div. So you might be wondering, how do we fix this? If there is a way to stop the pattern from collapsing while still using absolute positioning on the child. You can do this, which is quite hard, tricky is, but you are, so the thing here is that why in the first place you want to do that, right? Why you don't go out with another tool, right? In general, absolute positioning is intended to be used in situations where we don't want it to affect its surrounding layout. And this is a good general, and again, this is according to the author's thinking. Why am I saying this? Because the font he used. So absolute positioning is intended to be used in situations where we don't want it, we don't want to affect its surrounding layer. If you find yourself running into this problem over and over, it is likely that you are reaching for an absolute positioning in a situation where another layout will be more appropriate then. So this is a behavior that happened here, and I started to understand here. So this is a behavior that happened here, right? Especially when you promote an element into an absolute position. And then the absolute size and how all of this absolute size works here. Let's take a look at this.
So here we have an absolutely positioned element. As it stands, it's just kind of hanging out near the top left corner of the viewport. And I have this display property. And I'm curious, I'm going to ask you the question. What do you suppose happens if I change this element to have a display property of block?
That's interesting. That's a good question. Let me actually replicate that. If I put it this into yeah, let me do this. Right. If I open to a block, well, nothing should happen, because remember, well, I'm assuming that nothing should happen. So if I say display as block, right? So nothing will happen. Everything remains here. However, what I'm saying is that, hey, this element now is going to take all the available space. So in other words, this element will never line break the content. So in other words, it will continue to grow and grow and grow. And that's interesting, because unlike now, so for example, if you only have is this, right? Yeah, that's right. So and this is now a block, right? So it's going to continue to grow and grow and grow. Let me actually remove this as well. This display block is going to continue to grow and grow and grow until it fills the viewport. That's good. That's good. But what happens if I say display inline, for example, right? Is now going to line break the content, as you can see here, this, right? So in other words, look at how now the box actually behave, which is continue the content, and then right after that, but if you switch to the block, right, is now wrap the entire content and fit into this viewport. So if I do something like relative, position relative, right? If I say position relative, for example, like this, and then I say top 32 pixels, and top is top. What's top? Yes. And then I say left 32 pixels, right? And as you can see, now look at how this content actually behaves, because you're modifying the position of where this content is going to be rendered. And especially if you render more and more on that, so the display block, or if I say display inline, in this case, so the element is putting all of the normal flow here. So you are not modifying is the layout. And when you combine this with display inline on display block, they still now apply to the box, but in a way that is different. How so? Block is going to wrap the entire content and grow as much as possible until it fits the interesting, until it fits the until it fits the viewport. This is by default, right? And this is something that you see a lot of the time when some websites are using heavily this layout, the positioning layout, to promote a particular element, particularly menus, all right? And then now you can like scroll down more, you know? So it allows me to scroll a bit more of the content here. So the website is not fitting the entire viewport. So there are some elements that now expand the layout, right? And now I get it here.
Well, we can try it. and nothing really changes. And I suppose it makes sense, right? We're applying these styles to a div, and the default value of display for divs is block. So then what do you suppose happens if I change it to inline? Well, we can try that too, and anticlimactically, nothing happens. And this is one of those common points of confusion for people, so I really want to take a moment and talk about it. Different layout modes use different properties in different ways.
Different layouts mode use different properties in different ways.
We've been talking a lot about flow layout in this course so far, and in flow layout, display block and display inline are vital ingredients to the ultimate layout for the element. With positioned layout, it doesn't quite matter as much. When we're talking about absolute positioning, this value isn't used at all. The algorithm doesn't care what the value of display is unless we set it to none. If we set it to none, then it hides, like it does in every layout algorithm. But in terms of display inline, display block, that distinction doesn't make sense. There's no such thing as a block level absolute element. Where this gets a little bit muddy is around relative positioning, because with relatively positioned elements, you actually can change the display value and it has an effect. Relative positioned elements inherit a lot of their layout from whatever the layout mode otherwise used is. Relative is kind of like this weird middle ground between positioned layout and whatever else it is, whether it's flow layout or flexbox. So that's like a bit of an exception. But when we're talking about absolutely positioned elements and sticky and fixed, and in general just every layout mode, every element is rendered using a single layout mode, and different layout modes use different properties. So this property has no effect for absolutely positioned elements, but then that opens a new question, which is how does an absolutely positioned element determine its size, right? Because in flow layout, a block level element is greedy and will expand.
Exactly.
An inline element goes with the flow. We've talked about that. What about absolute elements? Well, we can kind of get a sense from what we're seeing over here that it's closer to inline, but not exactly. An absolutely positioned element wants to be as small as it can, because in general, this is kind of what you want, right? Usually absolutely positioned elements are meant to kind of stick in a given spot, and you don't want them to be growing. You kind of just want the element to be whatever it is in whatever place you put it. So it's going to shrink to fit the content. But what if we have
It's going to shrink to fit the content.
a lot more content? And this is where it starts to get a little bit interesting. I've given it a distance from the left, but I haven't given it a distance from the right. And you might think it would just grow and grow and grow and grow, but it actually stops once it hits the right edge of the viewport. To be a little bit more precise, it's stopping when it hits the edge of its containing block, and this is one of those hidden mechanisms we're going to talk about much more very soon. For now, we can just think of it as the viewport. So this is kind of interesting, right? It grows until it reaches a point where it can't grow anymore while still fitting in the viewport, and then it forces a line wrap. And if I was to add a distance from the right, if I was to say right 32 pixels, well now, instead of it going all the way to the edge of the container, it's going to go until it reaches 32 pixels away from the container, and then it line wraps. What do you suppose happens, though, if it can't line wrap? So let's imagine that I remove all of the spaces, right? And we're going to talk much more about this algorithm in the future. Essentially, the way the line wrapping algorithm works is it looks for soft wrap opportunities. And this is things like spaces or dashes, right? Anything that it can wrap without kind of breaking the flow of the words. So when I do this, and I'm almost done here, I do kind of break my editor, which is a little bit unfortunate. Maybe this will be fixed by the time you watch this. But something interesting happens over here. The box, right, the rectangle is still going to take up the same size. It's going to be 32 pixels from either edge of the viewport, but the content is now introducing this horizontal scroll bar. And it makes sense because we've given it kind of an impossible situation. We've said that it should be 32 pixels from the left, 32 pixels from the right, and then it should also contain its contents because that's how elements like to work, right? That's how the algorithm works. It grows and shrinks as needed based on the content size. But it can't really do that here. It can't grow to contain the contents because the contents are too large. So that's kind of a lot of independent pieces of information. Let's see if we can connect those dots and tell a compelling story about what this algorithm is doing. And I think the first takeaway I have is that absolutely positioned elements...
Yeah, the first takeaway that I have is absolute positionings now
are extremely compliant. And what I mean by that is they really want to follow the properties that we give it. So in this case, I have this really large, really unwieldy bit of content, but the box is kind of staying firm at exactly the priorities that we've given it. So we've said left 32, right 32, and that box is stable. And the same thing is true, by the way, if I use width instead. So if I was to say width 200 pixels, our box is going to be 200 pixels wide no matter what the content is doing. In general, it will try and line wrap the content, right? That's kind of its ideal, but it always makes sure to respect the priorities that we give it. If we give it some leeway, though, so if I don't set a width and I don't imply a width by setting both a left and a right, well, then the box is going to grow as large as it has to contain the contents within its own environment. So this box doesn't want to break out of the viewport, right? It doesn't want to get so large that it doesn't fit, but it is willing to allow its content to overflow. So if the content is really big, if there's no white space, or maybe it's a really large image, then that image will be allowed to overflow without the box itself changing dimensions. So here we...
So now this is describing as the absolute size of how now the box is calculated here. When you open into a positioning absolute layer. So the key points here that I can take from this is that first, this box will behave in ways that particularly absolute is going to set the constraint for the content. So it's going to look for opportunity to do a soft opportunity to do a soft wrapping content. So for example, like white space or dashes. But if it cannot find that, it will now continue to grow that content until it finds it. So making now the content and the box in different dimensions. So that's interesting. Particularly the behavior of the absolute positioning. And that'll be all for this video. Take care. Bye bye.